Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Isabel Molina, and I am the Public Programs Producer here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I am very pleased to welcome you to today's discussion of Jewish space lasers, the Rothschilds, and 200 Years of Conspiracy Theories as part of our History of Anti-Semitism series. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you for joining us today virtually. We hope that if you're able, you will visit the museum in person to see our current exhibitions, including Courage to Act, Rescue in Denmark, the museum's first exhibition for visitors ages 9 and up, and Speaking Up, Confronting Hate Speech, which opens to the public on September 18th. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off will be posted in the chat. If you have questions for our speakers during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we will get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Again, that's the Zoom Q&A box and not the chat. Today, we are honored to be joined by Mike Rothschild and Britt Tevis. Mike Rothschild is a journalist who has spent the last decade writing about the rise and spread of conspiracy theories, hoaxes, scams, and moral panics. He is the author of the first complete book on the QAnon conspiracy movement, The Storm is Upon Us: How QAnon Became a Movement, Cult, and Conspiracy Theory of Everything. And his newest book is Jewish Space Lasers, The Rothschilds and 200 Years of Conspiracy Theories, on the history of the Rothschild banking family conspiracy theories and their role in modern anti-Semitism. As a subject matter expert in conspiracy theories and their impact, he has written hundreds of articles and been interviewed or featured by the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Yorker, the BBC, NPR, Rolling Stone, The Guardian, and many others. Mike has appeared on TV, on CNN, MSNBC, Peacock, PBS NewsHour, 60 Minutes Australia, Inside Edition, and on major podcasts including Maintenance Phase, QAnon Anonymous, the Lincoln Project podcast, Armchaired and Dangerous, and many others. He testified to Congress in 2022 on the danger of election fraud disinformation, has worked as an expert witness in civil cases related to conspiracy theories, spoken at numerous major conferences, and submitted written testimony to the January 6th Select Committee on the role of QAnon in the Capitol attack. He lives in Southern California. Britt P. Tevis, JD, PhD, is the Phyllis Backer Assistant Professor in Jewish Studies, in the Department of History at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. Her work focuses on the intersection of Jews and American law, with a special emphasis on the study of anti-Semitism. You all can purchase Jewish space lasers at the link posted in the chat. Thank you all again for joining us. And now I'm going to hand things over to Britt and Mike.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And thank you to the Museum of Jewish Heritage and Isabel for including me and inviting me to have this conversation today with Mike, who I am very excited to be in conversation with, especially because I've had the opportunity to hear him speak, and he's an exciting speaker. So this is exciting for me to be here today. So first, I just want to say that I have subject matter and appropriate background for our conversation today. For those curious as to what is behind me, this is a Jewish spaceship as imagined by the wonderful Mel Brooks and featured in History of the World Part 1. And so I thought I would include this just for thematic purposes today. I brought my own Jewish space laser and starship. And I really want to say first, Mike, that I so enjoyed your book for a number of reasons, which we'll get into in this conversation. Before we get into the content, I also want to congratulate the publisher and the graphic designer because it is a really beautiful text in addition to a really important and informative text. So yes, the eye for detail, I just thought it was a clever.
Got the menorahs shooting the lasers, got the
That's right.
all-seeing eye. It's
In this
oh
case,
yeah,
we can judge the book by its cover because it's a
yes.
fabulous cover and it's a fabulous book. So the cover it reflects its contents.
I wanted something for the cover that was not something like the other biographies of the Rothschilds, which is, 100-year-old pictures of castles and, guys in suits. I wanted something a little hipper and a little more interesting, and they really knocked it out of the park.
They did. So please, everyone, see that book. Everyone should go purchase it because it's a really useful text. So the text, as I read it, was a cultural and intellectual history of an idea, which is a very difficult assignment to take on. And that idea is that there is a rich and powerful family, and they are trying and have, in some cases successfully, taken over areas of power within the world for the past few hundred years. The length of time varies according to who you ask, but for several hundred years, there has been this quest. This family, of course, happens to be Jewish, and they happen to have the name Rothschild. And so this is not so much directly, first and foremost, I guess, this book is about the history of that idea and the power of that idea. And then secondarily, where possible, you have illuminated basically the untruths behind that idea. And I say where possible because, as you say in the book, number one, the archives are limited. You only have access to what exists from the past. And number two, it's impossible to prove a negative, to prove that something didn't happen. So I was really taken by the task that you set out for yourself, which is a really tricky thing to do. I speak as a historian. I know that tracing a concept, an idea through time is it's a widely, thing to be tracing. Why did you do that? Why did you take on this task? And how did you come to this project? What inspired you to write this book?
I won't say masochism. So obviously my last name is Rothschild, and I'm not related to the family. We actually, one of the things I wanted to do in this book was kind of figure out, okay, I've been saying I'm not related to the family ever since I started writing about conspiracy theories, but I actually wanted to figure out if that was true. We have a family genealogy. I talk about it at the end of the book that was commissioned several decades ago. And one of the things that book writes about is, well, we're not those Rothschilds, but we've gone into the world and made our own successes. But, this name Rothschild was something I just kept seeing over and over and over as I started writing about conspiracy theories. I would get comments like, a Rothschild debunking myths, how stupid do they think we are? And I knew I wasn't related to the family, or not in any way that was significant, but I wanted to know why that name. Why not the many, many other wealthy families, Jewish or not, that have had massively outsized roles in commerce and politics and culture? Why that name over and over and over again? Where did it come from? And what I ended up doing was kind of tracing it all the way back to that first idea of the Rothschilds, not just as wealthy and powerful, but as these string pullers with power over everything that happened in the world, trying to trace this kind of evergreen idea back to where it came from.
Okay, I was planning on asking this more towards the end of our question. Since you brought this up, I am curious with your last name. One thing that you bring up in this book is our recurrent accusations about name changing. Accusations that members of this family are hiding their true identities by changing their names in order to have greater freedom to do whatever they want to do. And I was just curious about what it has been like to be associated with this family that has been at the heart of so many anti-Jewish conspiracy theories for hundreds of years, and whether or not you heard growing up in your family from family members who had different experiences. And I ask this in particular because there is, of course, this really rich history. I'm thinking of the historian here, Kirsten Vermeglish, who wrote an amazing history of Jewish name-changing practices as a way to sidestep anti-Jewish animosity and anti-Jewish discrimination in the United States. So I'm curious, what your personal experiences have been growing up with this last name.
Well, I grew up in the Chicago suburbs. I was solidly middle class. My dad's a lawyer. My mom worked at the elementary school. We weren't wealthy. We didn't have palaces. We didn't have racehorses, and nobody thought we did. It really never came up because nobody that we knew thought we were related to the Rothschilds. It was just never something anybody thought about. Every so often there was a joke about, oh, we use the last name to get a family discount on a really nice bottle of wine. But it's never something I thought about until I started writing about conspiracism. And then the name was suddenly everywhere. And I had this thought of, oh, maybe I should have used a pen name, but then, people are going to figure it out. And then they're like, oh, why are you hiding? Just trying to change your name like a chameleon, like all the rest of you. At some point, it's just like, it's my name. And if you think all people who have the last name are related, that's your problem, not my problem.
Well, I want to push you on that. And I'm thinking just today, and in like the context today, at the end of this book, you really discuss like the resonance of this conspiracy theory in today's society, and particularly, on the internet, and how these ideas really do not exist just on the fringes. They have really proliferated within, the mainstream political culture. And so, I mean, particularly, I'm thinking, of kids being born today, like about whether or not you really feel complete safety and freedom in all spaces, or whether or not you have ever thought, what, is this because of my last name in any sort of context?
I have only felt that way in conspiracism. I think most people who are not anti-Semitic conspiracy theorists just don't think about it. You don't. I don't think that most people would associate meeting me with vast wealth and power. When
Well,
you
I'm
get into
glad.
the internet, that's a little different, particularly in some of the spaces I work in. But I've never felt unsafe. I've never felt shunned or anything like that because of my last name. I think it just doesn't really connect for most people.
Okay, I want to return to that momentarily. So because I wrote these questions out chronologically as I read this text. So the first, to me, to my mind, the strongest, the best reason to buy this text is because so there are conversations, and many conversations, ongoing conversations today about anti-Semitism. And we read and we see and we hear over and over again from politicians and from journalists and from pundits that anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory.
Mhm.
And often that's where the explanation ends. You might hear, oh, well, it's a conspiracy theory about Jews' desire to control the globe and the world. And the beauty of this text is that it actually breaks down the building blocks of that conspiracy theory and really explains the component parts, intellectually speaking, and the origins of those component parts. So for those of us who really want to understand what exactly is this conspiracy theory that people are referring to and pointing at as defining anti-Semitism, this book actually spells everything out for us. And it does so chronologically, which is extremely helpful, especially if you're historically oriented. But I know from writing myself that you didn't discover this information, chronologically. When researching a book, right, all of this information, these sources are coming at you unorganized, and you are having to craft this narrative. And I can imagine, because this narrative spans such a long period of time, and there are so many components, there's so many things going on, so many major historical episodes. Well, first of all, I thought he must be very fun at a party, because at a party you probably have like so many rich anecdotes and fun stories to tell, and you had to read and know so much in order to create this. But my question is, how did you do this? What was the process like for you? Because I can imagine this being very difficult to do and do so well.
Well, thank you. For me, it really was organization. Just really sort of when I would find something in a particular time period, I would put it in my file with other things from that time period, and really try to organize things around certain ideas. So when you're talking about the idea of the theory that Mayer Amschel Rothschild sent all his kids out into the financial capitals of Europe to go conquer the European financial world, that's not really what happened. But there are a number of different places where I could address that. There is the time when he died. There is the time when that myth really took off. There's the time when the Nazis weaponized that myth in films like the Rothschilds and their shares in Waterloo in 1940. It's really just a question of organizing and really a focus of not trying to solve every riddle of anti-Semitism throughout the last 3,000 years. It really is about focusing particularly on the Rothschilds, particularly on what's being said about them, and trying as much as possible to just stay on that road and not kind of wander down the other historical rabbit holes. So I think for me, it was really organization, and it was really focus, and it was just kind of moving things around and seeing what fit together, what flowed naturally. You know, for me, a book like this, it's really about flow. It's really about what, you know, one section moves really well into the next section without having to kind of train wreck together the transitions too much. And after a while, there was a lot of trial and error and a lot of just moving things around. And it kind of, it presented itself in a way that really made sense after a while.
I guess what struck me as being especially difficult is the fact that what you are talking about often has so little factual basis.
Right.
So in trying to explain kind of these really far out there ideas about causality, about why something happened, and that idea having very little grounded actual truth, and that to me is the reason why I imagine this being exceptionally hard. And there is a certain logic to this conspiratorial thinking that becomes evident, but to my mind, you have to really be in it for a really long time to see how the unspoken assumptions of the conspiracy theorists in order to understand how they are connecting these events, which to my mind, you know, the more rational among us wouldn't be putting these together. We wouldn't be making these intellectual or logical leaps. And so the writing about the irrational theories, to my mind, is like, well, how do you begin trying to explain something that is so painfully irrational?
Yeah, it's very much not trying to debunk it, because a lot of this stuff debunks itself. I mean, it's, you know, you can't, it's telling people over and over, that's not true, that's not true. That gets a little repetitive after a while. For me, it was, what is the historical context that would cause someone to believe this? Why would somebody think that the Rothschild family funds both sides of every war?
Right.
Why would somebody think that the Rothschilds were instrumental in founding the Federal Reserve? What was going on in the world that gave people the need for a scapegoat? What is it that didn't make sense in current events or politics or whatever, for which the answer was Jewish power and money and control? So when you look at something like the very first accusation against the Rothschilds in the pamphlet of 1846, where this anonymous author who went by Satan accused Nathan Rothschild of knowing the outcome of the Battle of Waterloo in advance. Well, the other part of that was that there was this train crash in France that killed a bunch of people, and it was on a Rothschild-owned line. It was on James de Rothschild's line. Well, people were looking for what happened there. Why? How could this have happened? And it's very easy to blame the owner of the train line, who happens to be a member of this incredibly wealthy and powerful Jewish family. There are historical reasons and contexts as to why these things take off. So that's much more interesting to me than just kind of trying to prove it's not real, because you really can't prove it's not real.
You just brought up the Battle of Waterloo and the accusation that Nathaniel Rothschild knew the outcome and profited from Napoleon's loss.
Yeah.
One thing I noticed in this book is that so many of the events that become mythologized by conspiracy theorists, the mythologizing happens, years, if not decades after the event itself. So we have, Waterloo in 1815, but it's not until the late 1840s that it becomes this conspiracy theory about the Rothschilds. Similarly, the Civil War, you write that accusations that the Rothschilds are funding both sides of the Civil War do not emerge until the 1920s, right? About 50-ish years after that conflict. Similarly, it's not until 1934 that there are murmurings about the Rothschilds being in control of the Federal Reserve. And so to me, that was interesting. And I was hoping that you could remark about that phenomenon, but also discuss the fact that it seems today, within several months of the appearance of COVID, there were also the appearance of flyers globally that, accusing Jews of being responsible for for COVID. And it seems like the accusations are coming in real time in this moment, whereas as these earlier accusations, they take some time. And I was wondering if you could talk about your impressions about that.
Yeah, it was one of the things that really struck me is how long it took some of these things to really permeate into the culture of the time. It would take decades, it would take generations at times. Nobody during the Civil War was saying that the Rothschilds had orchestrated the entire war to take control of the United States. There were theories in papers of the time that the Rothschilds were somehow linked to the Confederacy or funding the Confederacy, but nobody really thought this was some sort of global string pulling thing. There wasn't this sort of evil empire stuff going on. I think part of it is just information really just traveled a lot slower back then. It just took a long time for news to make its way across the world and for opinions to formulate about that news. You didn't have this sort of instantaneous, reporting on things as they were happening. It just took a long time. A lot of things bubbled up because people were just kind of trying to figure out what had happened, and the first draft of history had been written, and a lot of people in subsequent generations just weren't satisfied by it. They were just looking for better explanations. That's why a lot of conspiracy theories take off. The explanation that we have, the official story, as you'll hear with a lot of these things, it's just not enough for some people. They need more. They need a grander plot. And when you have somebody like the Rothschilds, I think they serve that plot really well. There's always going to be money to be made by pinning the ills of the world on people who are vastly more wealthy and powerful than you. And the technology of the time just didn't allow for news to travel quickly. Now, of course, conspiracy theories happen as an event is happening. That's what social media has allowed. That's what the internet has allowed. And of course, now you don't have 30 years between the event and the accusation. You have 30 seconds, which is a lot harder to deal with. Oh, you froze, Brett. Oh, hello.
I couldn't tell if you were frozen or if I'm frozen.
I saw you were frozen for me. I may have been frozen for you.
And vice versa. Apologies for that. I'm actually going to go and try to open this door.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to blame the Jewish space lasers
I
for
agree.
the glitches that we're having right now. So one thing I just want to return to this idea of the mythologizing of the Rothschilds happening in some cases years, in some cases decades after the events themselves. And one thing that struck me and kind of sent my blood pressure up was the thought that Jews they can never, that there's always a potentiality. There's always a potentiality of being blamed. Jews are nowhere near an event, or have just the lightest or weakest tie to any given episode. The evidence in your book suggests that any given point in time, they can actually be transferred, right? Jews can be placed into any historical moment and then blamed for that historical moment. Do you have any thoughts on that? On what I kind of felt hopeless under coming to this.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it takes on a life of its own after a while, and it becomes so pervasive in conspiracist culture that it's just a lot easier to fall back on Jews in general and the Rothschilds in particular. One of the things I really realized in reading, 2 centuries of this material is it really does recycle the same ideas over and over again. Some of the names change, some of the dollar amounts get inflated. It gets produced faster and with new technology, but the accusations are always kind of the same. And a lot of these content creators, as we call them now, I mean, the same people who were, printing the self-published pamphlets 200 years ago are basically the same people who are doing the live streams and podcasts now. They don't, right. They don't want to do a lot of work because they have you have to make a lot of this stuff. So it's a lot easier to just grab the Rothschilds because the Rothschilds are already there in the culture. You want to blame wealthy, powerful Jews for creating the Federal Reserve during the 1930s when the Depression's going on. Well, everybody knows the Rothschilds just do that. it takes a lot less work. And I think ultimately what you have with a lot of these conspiracists is a kind of shorthand and a kind of laziness in a lot of cases.
That's funny. I always tell my students, white supremacists are not creative as a group. They just
No, not at all.
wash and repeat. And that goes not just in the case of anti-Semitism, but, anti-Black racism. Oh, it works to exclude people. Let's exclude Jews too.
Right.
So there's a lot of copying going on. Uh, uh, a lack of creativity. That's really their problem, first and foremost.
Yeah.
The next question I had was about uh, the post World War II moment. You do a lot of amazing work connecting individual influential anti-Semitic texts to other individual influential anti-Semitic texts, and you see, oh no, all of these texts are related over time. But we can actually draw a straight line between so many of these thinkers, and the works they produce, and then later thinkers and what's going on today. And so I'm just wondering your impression. We've read recently, the journalist Franklin Foer, for example, wrote an article about the post-World War II period representing this golden age, which lasted from the end of World War II, supposedly through 9/11. And your book really illustrates that these right-wing conspiracy theories about Jews emerge in the United States. Not emerge, they emerge much earlier, but they proliferate almost much more rapidly in this post-war moment and continue, through the age of the internet. So I'm curious if you could reflect on and your thoughts on the argument about the post-World War II period being this golden age and how your book challenges that idea.
Yeah, I think a lot of the proliferation of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories after the war is really starts with where they were coming from before the war, which was this fear of communism. And this idea that, Eastern Europeans, Russians in particular, were migrating to the United States and they were taking their Bolshevism with them. They wanted to take control of the United States. They wanted to, assimilate all of us. So I think you have this huge industry of anti-communist conspiracy theories of the Red Scare. You have the rise of the John Birch Society, all of these things that are explicitly anti-communist, but they also deal with this idea of Judeo-Bolshevism. This idea that, and of course, this is inherently a paradox, the idea that all of these enormously wealthy Jews are also committed communists who want to equalize income for everybody. It doesn't make any sense, but it doesn't have to, because at this point, you're just dealing in fear. You're dealing in fear of communism, certainly of the military might of the Soviet Union, but also of infiltration, of the idea that our universities, our government, the media, entertainment, banking are all infested with communists, and they're all secret Jews taking their orders from Moscow. It's this idea that you can't trust anybody. Everyone's out to get you. I'm the only one who has the answers. I'm going to tell you who the enemy is. And yes, the enemy is the communist, but the communist and the Jew go hand in hand. It's sort of classic Judeo-Bolshevist anti-Semitism. It was on the American right before the war. It was certainly, in Nazi Germany, and it was on the American right after the war.
So turning towards the second half of the book chronologically, or I guess the last third of the book chronologically. Well, first I want to ask, when we, in popular culture talk about anti-Semitism, there are some go-to names: Henry Ford, Father Coughlin, the radio priest from Detroit. Sometimes we'll hear Walt Disney. But I think that so many of the major players in this space in the post-war era are forgotten about. We really rarely hear about them, and that's something I really like about this book, is that you have put them in conversation with these earlier figures and these earlier texts. And we heard about Gerald L.K. Smith, and we heard about William Pelly, and we hear about names that I think somehow have flown more under the radar in these conversations. And I'm wondering, why do you think it is that the early 20th century American anti-Semites get a lot more airtime than necessarily some of the figures that you talk about, who have been so important and so influential in disseminating anti-Semitism? First, I was wondering about your thoughts about that.
Oh, sure. I think, in the case of somebody like Ford or Father Coughlin, they were just first. And they were among the biggest. I mean, Father Coughlin had a gigantic audience. It's absolutely staggering how many people listened to Father Coughlin at a time when, national radio and things like that were still kind of really in their infancy. Henry Ford was enormous. I mean, the Ford Motor Company was omnipresent in America. So they were there first, and they were there the biggest. And I think with a lot of the post-war figures, they are so unpleasant. I think a lot of people just don't want to talk about them. You have a figure like Gerald L.K. Smith or Eustace Mullins. I mean, there's a name who comes up over and over in conspiracism, and there is very little scholarship about him. I've sort of toyed with the idea of trying to write a biography of him, but it's like, God, I don't want to like look into his face for the next 2 years. That's just icky. They're just genuinely awful people, and there's just more of them. So I think when you have only a few very well-known figures who are controlling the conversation, you focus on those figures rather than their sort of proliferation of acolytes, who in many cases are much worse.
Right. And speaking of, much worse, and you brought up Eustace Mullins. So Eustace Mullins was tremendously influenced by the poet Ezra Pound.
Right.
But Mullins then goes on to be an important figure for Alex Jones, who is kind of in some ways the Coughlin of today, insofar as he is correctly cast as a right-wing conspiracy theorist. For those of you unfamiliar with his name, he's I think probably most well known in this moment for being sued for accusing the parents of the victims of the Sandy Hook, the children murdered in Sandy Hook as being liars, and that entire episode is being made up. Their parents, the victims' parents, successfully sued him for libel and defamation, and he now owes them, I think, a few hundreds of millions.
It's like over $1 billion right now.
Yeah. But he also engages in all sorts of conspiracy theories, including classically anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. But it's not just Alex Jones. It's not just the fringe right. Glenn Beck, Ben Carson, Reagan is reading these texts, and to be honest, I should preface this question by saying, especially for our listeners out there, that I am painfully aware that anti-Semitism is alive and well on the political left. I understand that, but this text is primarily looking at a very specific conspiracy theory, which is especially prominent among the political right in the United States. And I read this again. It made me very anxious and fearful, particularly as this book marched into the present. I was hoping you could comment both on this idea of fringe versus mainstream, and what your impressions are about the longevity and the ubiquity of this Rothschild conspiracy in right wing and on the right in American politics today.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think what we want to believe is fringe is not actually that fringe. And you have a book like None Dare Call It Conspiracy from 1971, written by Gary Allen, who was a John Birch Society speechwriter. This was a hugely influential book. This book sold as many as 5 million copies. Books don't sell 5 million copies anymore unless, it's like Stephen King or something. Sorry?
Except your book.
Yeah, well, hopefully, one can hope. But of course, None Dare Call It Conspiracy is the book more than any other that inspired Alex Jones. He's talked about it many times. These books are hugely popular. You look at a book like Behold a Pale Horse by Bill Cooper, one of the sort of godfathers of the 90s militia movement. Sold hundreds of thousands of copies. It's still in the top 1,000 on Amazon. Cleon Skousen's book, The Naked Communist, another hugely influential book for Alex Jones, for Ronald Reagan. Reagan extolled Cleon Skousen. These books were really popular. This stuff works. It's always worked. The storytelling aspects, the scapegoating aspects, that is always going to be appealing to some people. And they find these books, and then they create their own content. Of course, now it's easier than ever to do that. You really just need an internet connection, and you need to just put out a lot of nonsense. And if you're lucky, you'll grow an audience from it, and then you can make it into a job. So this stuff has always found audiences, but there was always a public veneer with kind of prominent politicians and media figures of, we don't want to touch this stuff. This is all nonsense. We want nothing to do with this. And then when it would kind of crop up as having political power, when you see somebody like Pat Buchanan in 1992, it would very quickly get stamped down by the establishment. Now this stuff is the establishment. It's not fringe anymore. And it's just part of the discourse now. And people are going back and they're finding all of this stuff and they're repackaging these ideas. So I think where it was fringe to a certain group of kind of establishment people, it's not anymore, but it was always there. It's always kind of popular with a certain type of person.
Speaking to my anxieties, I was curious, you referenced at the start of a conversation that these conspiracy theories are something like they're code reading, right? You have to actually be pretty well versed in the tropes and in the ideas that are involved in this conspiracy, because, for example, this idea about Nathaniel Rothschild at Waterloo, the train crash, all of these things that, like, they're very particular. And I'm curious, now that you are fluent in this language and are so familiar with these tropes, whether you feel like you see them more than you otherwise, like how frequently are you like you hear the dog whistles very clear, probably clearer than most people. How often are you hearing them? And do you have any regrets about becoming so educated in this material?
Oh, I have nothing but regrets. I hear them constantly. I mean, anytime you hear globalist, European bankers, London financiers, that is some sort of code word for Jewish money. Certainly Soros. I mean, anytime you're talking about Soros-backed DAs, Soros-funded protests, Soros-funded migrant caravans, it's just another word for Jews are running everything. And some of the people who are putting it out there genuinely don't know that. A lot of them do. Of course, these people will swear up and down they're not anti-Semitic, or at least they used to. There used to be that veneer of, I'm not anti-Semitic. I love the Jewish people. I just am asking questions about who really runs things. You have this classic case of Pat Robertson with his book, The New World Order, in 1991. It was a New York Times bestseller. After a couple of years, some prominent conservative Jewish journals figured out that he was basically sourcing from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And when he was called out, he said, "Oh, I would never do that knowingly. I'm just trying to figure out who is the Luciferian Global Finance Illuminati Alliance." I mean, come on. But there was always the fig leaf of, I don't hate all the Jews. I'm just concerned about these people who happen to be Jewish. That veneer is pretty much gone now, which is almost refreshing, because now we can at least kind of talk about what we're talking about. But yeah, there's always been that sort of coded language, the secret wink and nod to who's really running things. The problem is now it's just not secret anymore.
You've alluded, you've used the phrase New York Times bestseller several times, Alex Jones, Pat Robertson. One thing that struck me in this book is the fact that there's so much money to be made in perpetuating these anti-Semitic myths about the Rothschilds. And I just wondered, what your thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's incredibly lucrative. There is always money to be made in scaring people and then offering them the solution to what scares them, which is probably their book or their speaker series or their supplements or whatever it is. I mean, we were just seeing this week in the news that, this idea that the Russian media was funding American right-wing propaganda. I mean, like, directly funding it. And the people who are putting this stuff out there, they say, "Oh, I have no idea. I'm the real victim here." But the bottom line is that there's always going to be an audience for this stuff. There is always a much bigger audience for fear-mongering and scapegoating than there is for rationality and people saying, no, here's what's really going on. People want to believe that Santa Claus is real. They don't want to be told that Santa Claus is not real.
I want to offer a final question, that just to say the book is not all doom and gloom. And one of my favorite parts about this book was reading about the importance as as really kind of communal examples that the Rothschilds have played for Jews globally. You included this amazing example about the 70 something show, The Rothschilds.
Right, the musical, The Rothschilds.
That's right.
Yes.
And one of my favorite facts that I learned, and I didn't know this, was that the original for Fiddler on the Roof, their original song, "If I Were a Rich Man," was originally based on "If I Were a Rothschild."
Right.
And
Right.
so,
Yeah.
yeah. So I was just hoping you could comment about the role that the real Rothschilds have played in Jewish communal life, and how they've served actually as a symbol of hope and have been meaningful for Jews globally.
Sure, and that was a real eye opener for me. I didn't actually know that. I was in Fiddler on the Roof when I was in high school. The original Shalom Aleichem story is "If I Were a Rothschild," and Bach and Harnick, who wrote Fiddler on the Roof, they changed it to give it a more Western appeal. But in Hebrew and the Yiddish version that was put up a few years ago, it's still "If I Were a Rothschild." The Rothschilds have really served as a beacon of hope, of aspiration. You know, all the sort of stories and jokes from the old country, they revolve around, well, if a Rothschild comes to your door, you don't want your cottage to be messy. You know, this idea that, you know, the Rothschilds were the highest goal that a Jewish person could attain. You know, there's this op-ed from 1990 that Elie Wiesel wrote when the Rothschilds musical was revived on Broadway, talking about when he was growing up, the Rothschilds were talked about with this reverence, this sort of awe of one day you could be that. If you succeeded, if you went out into the world and you did well and you came back and helped your own people, you could stand alongside the Rothschilds. So while there's this vast industry of conspiracy theories and, you know, ridiculous myths about them, they've really served as a beacon of hope for the Jewish people in some very, very dark times. And I think that's one of the reasons why there's been all these myths and conspiracy theories about them, because they were always very publicly Jewish. They didn't assimilate, they didn't convert, they were proudly Jewish. Their philanthropy was based in Jewish causes. So they really stood their ground. And while it subjected them to an enormous amount of abuse, it also made them an object of aspiration for a lot of Jews.
And that was one of the chapters in this book that I thought was really quite lovely, was really eye-opening for me, especially because you wove it in so beautifully into this much more worrying and troubling narrative of history. It is now that time for us to turn this Q&A over to the audience. And so I believe I'm going to be receiving questions that I'm going to be posing to you from our secondary host, Isabel. And so the first question that she has sent from the audience is, in your estimation, what is the most important thing that you want people who read this book to take away from it? What is the main hope that you thought that you want them to walk away with?
That's a great question. I would say that the main thought to walk away with is just that there are historical reasons why Jews have always been blamed for certain things. And I think understanding those reasons and understanding the context of why the Rothschilds have always been picked out, I think helps us identify that blaming and that scapegoating happening in the present, and it'll happen in the future. You know, the last chapter is really about how Soros has become the Rothschilds of the 21st century. And of course, George Soros is in his 90s. He's not going to be around forever. His son Alex is taking over the philanthropic empire. And you're already starting to see kind of the shift from George to Alex in the conspiracy theorizing. So I think for me, it's understanding where this stuff comes from and recognizing how it is weaponized so that we can spot it and push back against it.
The second question from the audience is, how do you think conspiracy theories have changed over time?
They are probably about as prevalent as they used to be. You know, I don't think the internet has made us all conspiracy theorists. I think many people still are completely repelled by all of this stuff. But I think the change is now that it is much easier to access and it travels much faster. To be a conspiracy theorist, you know, really even in the 90s, you had to know where the weird bookstore was. You had to find the guy who was selling the bootlegged copies of Behold a Pale Horse. You had to put some work into it. It doesn't take any work now. You can find any conspiracy theory that you want, blaming anybody for anything almost immediately, and probably find a community of people who also believes the same thing. So the isolation and the siloing and the marginalizing of conspiracy theorists, that's not really true anymore. They now find each other in communities that don't need to be physically close to each other at all. So I think the prevalence of belief is about the same, but the access and the speed is much faster.
Another question has to do with some of your other work, which is being an expert witness on conspiracy theories. Can you speak to that experience a little bit?
Sure. So I've been doing that for about 3 years now. I've been hired to work as an expert witness by both plaintiffs and defendants working in legal cases related to essentially defamation revolving around conspiracy theories. So a lot of the cases I've worked on have involved QAnon. Some of them have involved the 2020 election. People being accused of being conspiracy theorists, people suing corporations or media figures for calling them conspiracy theorists or QAnon believers. For me, it is taking these ideas that seem incomprehensible and ridiculous and bizarre and boiling them down into a narrative that a judge will be able to understand, that a jury will potentially be able to understand, and to take something that seems like it's just kind of harmless and really elucidating the real world harm of all of this stuff. And what I found is that this stuff is kind of everywhere, but it's very hard for certain professions to kind of catch up with it. So, there's a story that during one of the Trump trials, there was a Facebook post by somebody who claimed that they knew Trump was going to be found guilty, and then the New York State court had to let both parties know that this Facebook post had been made, but didn't put any information about like who posted it, where it came from. Is this just trolling? Is there an actual leak? And I think courts, major corporations, media companies, they've got to understand where this stuff comes from and what it means. And that's kind of what I've been able to do in the last few years as an expert witness. And it's really quite gratifying to be able to do this and kind of affect change at those levels.
Relatedly to speaking about QAnon, someone asked about the transition from writing your first book about QAnon to writing about anti-Semitism and the Rothschilds. And I'm gonna tag on my own question to that question, which is about, I'm curious, what's on the frontier? What are you going to be tackling next?
Well, for the QAnon, I really kind of started looking at that very early on because it wasn't something that people were really taking seriously. I started seeing these Q posts. QAnon started in October of 2017, and I started noticing this stuff maybe a month or two later. And it felt very similar to a lot of the currency scams and kind of guru-driven financial windfall things that I'd written about, except the windfall in that case was going to be, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton are like executed on pay-per-view, and then the world lives in peace and freedom after that. And I thought, oh, this is kind of troubling. We really should pay attention to this. And of course it was, don't pay attention, don't give it oxygen, don't platform it. And I think now we know that that does not work at all. But of course, the Rothschilds come up quite a bit in QAnon. So for me, writing this book in some ways was almost a prequel to the QAnon book. It was like, well, how did we get here? Why does this movement talk about this family so much? So that's really where the transition is. I think the QAnon stuff and the anti-Semitism, they totally revolve around each other. For me, what's next on the horizon, it doesn't really depend on the election for me. I think no matter what happens in a couple of months, this stuff is going to be part of our culture, part of our commerce, part of our politics now forever. And I think certainly I'm keeping an eye on what is going to be the next iteration of all of this, what is going to be the next QAnon. But I think one of the things I really want to do is kind of bring this work to a bigger audience, to an audience that is not necessarily plugged into social media, that's not necessarily plugged into podcasts, things like that. So I'm developing Jewish Space Lasers as a documentary series. I'm working on another book pitch that would kind of tie together all of the strands of conspiracism from the Clintons to COVID, kind of zooming out and kind of trying to figure out what all the patterns are and how this is going to reoccur, because of course it's going to reoccur. These seismic shifts in paranoia and fear mongering, they happen almost once a decade, and we're going to be due for one in another couple of years. And I think it's really worth it to get ahead of that and try to see what it might be before it happens.
Another question, and this probably should have come at the start of this conversation, which is Marjorie Taylor Greene, discuss. Quote from the questioner.
Yeah, one of the things that I didn't really realize until I wrote this was that she never used that phrase, Jewish space lasers. She'd written this insane Facebook post about, Pacific Gas and Electric and the laser power transmission and the fire and the wildfires in California in 2018. But that phrase Jewish, she never uses the word Jewish. She talks about Rothschild Inc. and isn't that interesting, which of course is the same thing. It's one of those dog whistles. It's relating something to a wealthy Jewish banking family and say, "Ooh, that's curious, isn't it?" Well, it's not really. But if you just say something, "Oh, that's unexpected, that's interesting," it perks up the ears in conspiracy theory believers. I think with Marjorie Taylor Greene, I think we make a mistake in thinking that she's dumb, that she's an idiot, she doesn't know what she's doing. I think she really does know what she's doing. I don't think she's a particularly intelligent or curious person. But when she tweets these things that are really, really ridiculous, she wants people to share them. She wants people to retweet them and say, "Oh, look how stupid she is," because she gets the engagement. And then she gets to say, "Well, they think we're dumb. They underestimate us. We're going to show them at the ballot box. And then, well, maybe we'll escalate things if we need to." I think there is a disservice that we do ourselves by writing these people off as dumb, when I think they're actually quite good at getting attention and making people angry.
I absolutely agree with that sentiment. Uh, uh, it's constantly under the guise of we're just asking questions. I'm just innocently raising questions. There are no dumb questions. And it provides a tremendous amount of cover for nefarious intent.
Yeah.
And then what's shocking to me, I guess, is the lack of any sort of guilt or shame about using Jews as
Right.
a tool in order to gain a following and gain stature and, I guess, clout within certain populations. One listener asks, do you think there are any effective ways to combat harmful conspiracy theories?
There are, and unfortunately, they are very difficult to apply at scale, but we can apply them in our own lives. And it's something that I've been really talking about as the election approaches, which is really taking a step back and just pausing before you're going to share that conspiracy theory or that thing that really made you mad. Just stop and think, is this real? Did this actually happen? Spend just a minute or two looking into it, trying to figure out where this came from. Who wants me to share this? Who is trying to make me mad? And just not doing it. We can be the fire break for ourselves in not sharing conspiracy theories and not sharing hoaxes. And certainly nobody's perfect, but we can kind of tamp down on the spread of these things in our own lives and in the lives of people that we care about. If you have somebody in your life who is constantly sharing this stuff, I think you can pull them aside and say, "Hey, that's an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. I don't think you're anti-Semitic, but here's where this came from." I think most people really do not want to be thought of as hateful or hating Jews or whatever. I think if you let them know in a very kind of calm way, not picking a public fight, not trying to debunk them, certainly not trying to insult them publicly, I think people can back down. I think it's hard. And I think, unfortunately, there are far more people who just live, breathe, and eat this stuff all the time and really can't be reached. But I think some people genuinely don't want to be thought of as people who share nonsense. And you can step in certain cases, and really you can do it in yourself, and really very, very, be very diligent about what you share, what you're reading, what you're passing along. There are ways to combat it. It just has to be very small scale, unfortunately.
One listener asked a question I think is compelling, and this probably will be the last question, which is, how does a lie rise to the level of conspiracy theory? What makes a conspiracy theory conspiracy theory?
That's a great question. And it's one of those definitions where you get a lot of this, like, "Oh, you debunk conspiracy theories. Are you saying conspiracies aren't real?" Well, no, of course conspiracies are real. I mean, we know that. There's everything from the conspiracy to assassinate Julius Caesar to tobacco companies conspiring to hide the ill effects of smoking. I mean, anytime you get multiple powerful people plotting together, that is a conspiracy. What we're talking about with conspiracy theories is these kind of things that are passed around and have been passed around for decades of, the government's hiding evidence of UFOs, or they're putting fluoride in our water to make us stupid, or they know the Secret Service really killed Kennedy. Those are kind of conspiracy theories, but they've never been proven. And in fact, they've been disproven many times. So I think when you're talking about a conspiracy theory, you're talking about this idea that powerful people have been conspiring to do these things and everyone knows about it. It's just that no one does anything about it. And they plot in secret, but there's no secrecy. And some of those two things like never clash with each other. And you think about 9/11 conspiracy theories, the idea that the Bush administration or whoever blew up the Twin Towers and everybody knows it and just like no one's doing anything about it. And we've all just agreed that they did it. But that's a classic conspiracy theory, because it really at some point just devolves into the land of wishful thinking. And so I think, when you're looking at a lie and a conspiracy theory, you really need to look at, why do people want me to believe this? How are they profiting off of this belief? And I think at that point, you very quickly find that it's kind of the same group of influencers and authors and pundits and content creators who are doing this.
Okay, we have time for one more, and I just because I really love this question, it's something I loosely think about also, which is for those of us who can understand, in the Mel Brooks fashion, just how ridiculous the idea of Jewish space lasers is there any element of fun that's going on, particularly for people who are they believe quasi what they're saying, right? The people who are passing along these memes and especially these jokes online, but they're cultural. There's cultural currency and to these ideas beyond whether or not the truth of them, and the truth in some ways doesn't matter. So the question is about fun and whether or not there's an element of fun involved for people who are espousing these ideas and sharing them. Or is it all doom and gloom when they're generating them?
Well, it's interesting. It's a really good question. It's really both. I think certainly there is a storytelling element to a lot of this stuff. And I think the reason why things like the Rothschilds rule the world or QAnon took off is because it's a kind of a classic good versus evil story. You get to be the good guys, especially with something like QAnon, which has this participatory element. You're making memes, you're making videos, you're sharing all these things. You get to be part of this. It's almost like you get to be in the Rebel Alliance, and everybody wants to feel like they're part of something bigger than their kind of boring workaday lives. That's where the fun aspect of this comes. And I think a lot of these people really do enjoy the storytelling aspect of it. At the same time, they are joyless, miserable people in a lot of cases. You look at their social media, they hate everything. They're terminally depressed. They're terminally bored. They can't watch the TV shows they used to watch. They can't listen to the music they used to listen to. They hate sports. They hate fun. They're just their families hate them. They're spending Thanksgiving eating bologna sandwiches and watching Alex Jones videos. It's like they think it's fun because there's the storytelling aspect that makes classic good versus evil stories fun. But really, if you boil that away, they're deeply, deeply unhappy people.
Well, we are now at the end of our hour, and I just wanted to say thank you again for being in conversation with me. I found this text tremendously useful, eye-opening, disturbing, but easy to read insofar as the prose were beautiful and well written. Hard to read insofar as sometimes you don't want reality to be reality.
Right.
Wish we had, wish you didn't have to write this.
Yeah.
But I'm looking forward to seeing its various iterations in the future, and also whatever you're going to be putting out next. So congratulations, and Jewish space lasers. Go get it. Thank you, and thank you to the museum for
yeah, absolutely. Thank you. This was a real honor.
Of course.
I'm really privileged to be able to do things like this.
Oh, well, thank you, everyone. I think I just turned my video off, but it's back on again. Mike and Britt, I just wanted to thank you both for taking the time to come speak to us today. I really found it informative, and I'm sure our audience did as well. I also want to thank all of our audience members for attending today and listening. I highly encourage everyone to purchase Jewish space lasers, which you can do at the link that I've posted in the chat. Also, if you enjoyed today's program, we hope you'll consider making a donation to the museum at mjhnyc.org/support and joining us for our upcoming programs, which you can find at mjhnyc.org/current events.